What is going on, everybody, and welcome to the playoff edition of the Stochastic NHL Strategy Show. I'm your host, Josh Harris. It is nice to see that you can win five figures again on DraftKings. They're running 10K to first today. They will be doing the puck drop on Monday, which is a $10 with 15K to first. Nice to see. But yeah, we're back for the playoffs. We didn't really go anywhere. We took yesterday off because there was no hockey at all, which was nice. It was, I think, the first or second day all season where there was no hockey. I didn't have to think about hockey. I let my brain decompress. Did I sleep? Yeah. Except I was up at 2:30 in the morning answering Slack messages for no goddamn reason. But I went to sleep before 10. It was great. What's going on, Cliffy? You pumped for the playoffs?
Yeah, I was definitely not asleep before 10. Went to Abigail last night. Fun horror movie, by the way. If anybody wants to go see it, I really enjoyed it. Didn't get home till 12:30. Then I watched the Jays pound the piss out of San Diego, which was always nice to see. Usually I dread those West Coast trips, but we're here to talk hockey. It is the first day of the NHL playoffs. Not really excited for Islanders Carolina, but Toronto Boston as the main event here tonight is really enticing. Obviously, it's one of the biggest rivalries since the 2013 lockout, basically. And even Islanders Carolina, I made a joke about it to the Rangers' expense in the Discord this morning. But when you have defense and goaltending like the Islanders do, which is a top 10 defense and great goaltending, at least Varlamov's been great. And Sorokin's been pretty good. It's just that Varlamov's been better. It's kind of that. It doesn't really put any game out of reach. You know what I mean? Unless they just get bombarded early. So it should still be nerve-wracking and tight-checking game. And those can be pretty exciting. And this is a rematch from last year. So even though it is kind of lopsided in Carolina's favor, and we'll certainly talk about that when we talk about the games, I'm starting to get excited for basically every playoff series. So, I'm jazzed. The playoffs are here. It's the best time of year. Even if it's only 2 games, we'll take those 2 games and then just kind of enjoy ourselves for 6 hours while we watch playoff hockey.
Yeah, I do enjoy watching some playoff hockey. I think Carolina's a wagon, and I think they'll handle the Islanders pretty well. They're just fucking loaded. So, and these current Islanders lines are absolute shit. So, I mean, we'll obviously get into it. Take a sip of a beverage here. It's a 2-game slate. That's kind of annoying. I was hoping they'd schedule a West Coast game for this slate, but they didn't. 2-game slate's a little bit interesting because you have some cheap goalies. I would say on a 2-game slate, especially in the playoffs, there's nothing really off the table. Even stacking a couple guys against your goalie, I think, is fine. Maybe we should touch on a little bit of strategy here, but I was thinking about coming out before the show. I was thinking about what I'm going to do tonight, and obviously I wait to build my lineups until after we talk it through. But it's you know what, Semyon Varlamov is 7,300. I like the Canes, but it's going to be hopefully a close-ish game. So you could put some Carolina skaters against your goalie there. I don't know about Leafs Boston. I mean, you can. I think the most obvious one is doing Hurricanes against the Islanders goalie, but the one thing we noticed is the pricing on everybody. They made everyone cheaper, which makes the pricing softer, which is a bit annoying. That's their way of drumming up interest or whatever. It's idiotic, but it's not going to be overly hard to build a lineup tonight. So what do you think about stacking against your goalie on this slate?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on the goalie. Carolina against Varlamov probably makes the most sense. I wouldn't be stacking Islanders 1 against Carolina, whether I assume it's going to be Anderson starting. I wouldn't do that just because Carolina limits shots so much. But as long as you think the shot volume might be there, it's perfectly fine. I'm not a guy to stack a line against threading the needle a little too thin. But certainly one-offs can do it. Like we'll just take Toronto, for example. We'll talk about the Leafs later, but assuming Samsonov starts, like Pasternak against Samsonov, like Pasternak could have a goal with 8 shots and Boston loses 4-2 or something like that. And both goalies can be, or both players can be optimal. So like, I'm perfectly fine with it. I wouldn't go so far as like full on like line stack, but a player or two, a defenseman, certainly, I think that's perfectly fine.
Yeah. I mean, the Islanders total is wildly low. So like full stacking Islanders one against Freddie could be bad on both ends there. So let's talk a little bit about this. I mean, we kind of did. We should just go right into the first game then. New York Islanders with a 2.2 total heading into Carolina. The Hurricanes have a 3.2. Like going into Carolina is the worst possible matchup in the East. Just like it's like going into Winnipeg in the West. The top line is gonna see that Stahl line, and that's just brutal. I mean, yeah, Svechnikov is on that line, but Stahl and Martinook have been. It doesn't really matter who their other winger has been because Fost is out, but like Stahl and Martinook have been ridiculously good in the defensive end together. They're going to get that Barzal, Horvat, Cizikas line. And, that it almost immediately takes me out on the Islanders top line on the slate in single entry. Now, if you're 150 maxing on a 2-game slate, you shouldn't really X anything out because it's in DFS and hockey, anything can happen on any given slate. But from a macro perspective, stacking against the Jordan Stahl line in a 2.2 total in single entry is frankly stupid. So I'm probably out on the Islanders top line. That second line is probably going to see a fair bit of that Aho line. And that Aho line has been absolutely ridiculous. Your Conn Smythe pick is Jake Gensel. Nelson Palmieri, Fasching haven't been good defensively. So, yeah, maybe like a one-off on that second line is fine. But, like, I'm not sitting here advocating at all for the Islanders here. It's just going to be a brutal matchup for them. Can they score? Obviously, they can score. But from a DFS perspective, trying to find that score in Carolina against an elite penalty kill, against an elite defensive team is just tough. If, I don't know, like maybe Engvall scores, but are you going to go play Engvall in your single entry? Probably not. You know what I mean? So if they get into your crunches or whatever for 150, I think it's a 150 max. It's fine. But like in my single entry lineup, you'd be hard pressed to see a skater or skater on the Islanders in my lineup. If I get maybe Mike Riley at 3,200 because he's top power play. I know it's an elite penalty kill. So, Noah Dobson, I don't know. Like maybe a defenseman here and there because they're going to have to block a lot of shots. But skaters, probably not. My interest is pretty heavily on the Carolina side, and that's not really a shocker. I do really like the top line, and they're the most expensive line on the night by far. They're 3,900 more expensive than the next highest line, which is insane. They have a 34.3% top 2 stack, 17.8% projected ownership. The issue I've had with them in the regular season was minutes. That is not going to be a concern in the playoffs. If it's a close game, they're going to play these guys heavy minutes. They're fully correlated on the power play, and the Islanders penalty kill sucks. So I do really like that top line. The second line is good too. There's just a question of whether it's going to be Jesperi Kotkaniemi or Jack Drury centering them in between Teravainen and Netchis. I even think the Stahl, Martinook, Svechnikov line is fine. The issue is there's outside of Carolina 1, there's nothing super expensive that you have to play with them. You know what I mean? Svechnikov one-off is fine. I really like the Carolina top line here tonight. It's not really an issue of who you can fit them with because, like, do you need perfect correlation on a 2-game slate? I don't think so, especially in single entry. If you want to run some 4-3-1s in your crunches for MME, go do that. But like for me in single entry, I'm not going to force correlation. If I happen to get there, I get there. But I'm not going to force it. But I do really, really like Carolina 1 here.
Yeah, I'll start on the Carolina side. I agree with you. Even with Pajot, we should mention my voice is coming out through your speaker somehow. I don't know what's going on there. Yeah, I don't because that's the first time that's happened this season. Welcome to the playoffs. Yeah, should mention something about JG Pajot. Pajot is looks like a game time decision, kind of. He got hurt in the final game of the regular season. Wasn't at practice yesterday. It's playoffs. You will not know if a player is in literally unless you see somebody snap their leg in two on the ice. You are not going to know whether a player is in or out until warm-up start. That's just kind of the way that playoffs work in the NHL. I get it, but it's just frustrating from our perspective. Carolina's top line is probably not going to see much of them. They'll probably see more of that Islanders second line. And you're right, that second line with Fasching on the other side just was not good down the stretch. Or at any point this season, really, whenever they played together. 68 shot attempts against, 2.5 expected goals against, 4.4 actual goals against per 60 at 5-on-5 for that Islanders second line. It's a really good matchup for Carolina 1. Carolina 1, 3.4 expected goals, 4.1 actual goals for per 60 minutes. They were absolutely dynamite. And the ice time got pulled back over the final 2 weeks of the season, but the ice time got pulled back for everybody on that team. All the top guys, at least, right? Brent Burns lost 3 minutes a game over the last 2 to 3 weeks of the season. They were basically in cruise control over the final month. Because they knew that no one was going to catch them for second. And I don't think they really cared whether they won the division or not. Their focus is on the Stanley Cup. It's not on winning the division or whatever, because this team has had some pretty good regular seasons recently. They just haven't made a Stanley Cup final in a long time. So they have the team to finally do it. So I'm not that worried about ice time. When Jake Gensel first got there was a couple weeks there where this line was playing 21, 22 minutes a game across the board, and they're perfectly correlated on the power play. I wrote up in the picks article, I talked about Seth Jarvis. He's on the second line with Gensel and with Aho. Now, Jarvis isn't a big volume shooter, which is fine because Gensel is, and Aho does land his fair number of shots as well. But as far as the power play goes, what I mentioned is Carolina's top power play unit with Gensel generated nearly 15% more shot attempts per 60 minutes. And they were scoring basically remember around Christmas when the Carolina was scoring 2 power play goals a game for 2 weeks? Yeah. That's basically what they did after they got Gensel. The power play just went nuclear, but they were generating a lot more too. And the fact that they were generating so much it was nice to see. And as much as the Islanders improved defensively under Patrick Waugh, and they legitimately did, they were a top 10 defensive team by just about any stat you want to look at. Shots, attempted shots, expected goals against, didn't matter. At 5-on-5, the penalty kill stayed bad. I think after the All-Star break, the only team that gave up more goals per minute on the penalty kill was Anaheim. The Islanders were down at the bottom, but they didn't take a lot of penalties. That was the problem. I think after the All-Star break, they were 31st by minor penalties taken per game, and from the deadline onward, they were last, and a distant last, meaning they were taking far fewer penalties than anybody else. So Carolina only gets 1 power play. Doesn't really mean a lot. Also should mention, speaking of power plays and penalty kills, there have been there's been a lot of work done. I think Micah Blake McCurdy, who runs the stats website HockeyViz, looked into this about penalties in the playoffs. And until the conference finals, penalties, power plays and penalty kills, the number of them per game doesn't really change from the regular season. They do start calling less once you get deeper into the playoffs, but for the first round, it's not something to worry about. I think what happens is that players just across the board play a lot dirtier, So the bar for taking a penalty is higher. They just call the penalties at the same rate. It's just, what qualifies as a penalty changes. But yeah, I agree with you. I really do like Carolina 1. The thing is like, even if you use Carolina 1, you can still put in like a one-off Matthews or a one-off Pasternak and then go fish some third line, Josh Stack with Carolina, go fish a third line from Boston or Toronto or something like that. Like, there are a lot of cheap depth options that you can use that you can still fit in the most expensive line on the slate plus the most expensive center or most expensive winger and be just fine with your lineup. So I think there are a lot of reasons to like Carolina 1 here. Carolina 2, I'm not as sold on. The reason is yes, Barry Kotkaniemi basically lost his role down the stretch. Like, the reason they went out and traded for Evgeny Kuznetsov was because they were relying on Jack Drury as the second line center because Kotkaniemi had lost his role. Now Kuznetsov is down on the fourth line. Kotkaniemi is on the second line. I wouldn't be shocked if Kotkaniemi is, quote, the second line center in the lineup card and ends up with the least amount of ice time of all the Carolina forwards. That's why I'm kind of worried about stacking Carolina 2, especially where they're coming in, 10% ownership. I'm not worried about ownership per se, but if there's going to be a lot of ownership on them and I'm not that secure in their ice time, I would be more fine with like a Natchez one-off or a Teravainen one-off than I would be full stacking the line. Carolina 3 and Carolina 4, I think, is where it gets really interesting. I actually wrote up the Carolina 4th line in the picks article today. It's the first time this season we've had a 4th line because I think it's the first time I've had a
playoffs, though. So, like, there's always a guy you're not expecting to score, and it could be bottom 6 guys.
Right. Yeah, very easily, especially where it's only 2 games, right? If both these games are 3-2 and like Stefan Noesen gets a goal here or like Jacob Lauko gets a goal against Boston, there's a reasonable chance they end up like one of the 10 highest performing skaters on the slate, right? Like, that all you need is that one goal because there's just not enough games to make up the difference elsewhere. Carolina 3, like, they were nuclear together. Like, absolutely insane. 80 shot attempts, 3.3 expected goals, 3.3 actual goals per 60 minutes. They're going to go out against the Islanders top line. The Islanders top line was not good defensively. Over 3 expected goals against per 60 minutes of 5-on-5. Now, the problem is Martinook's not on any of the power plays. Stahl's not on any of the power plays. And Svechnikov got bumped to power play 2. So there's just not a lot of special teams time there. And against such a bad penalty kill, I probably want guys that are on the power play. Like, I think a Svech one-off is fine, but it's just as far as full stacking goes, I don't think I'd use Carolina 3. I think I'd be more interested in Carolina 4. And it's weird, but I say that writing about them, again, picks article, free to read, up on Stokastic.com. 390 minutes together for Jack Drury and Stefan Noesen on the 4th line this season. 3.3 expected goals, 3.3 actual goals per 60 minutes, or 28% above the league average. This is the line going out against Islanders bottom 6 that heavily favors the Carolina 4th line, and both Kuznetsov and Noesen are on the second power play unit. Now, it's going to be like a 66-33 split, so they won't get a ton of ice time. But honestly, against a PK this bad, you don't need more than like 90 seconds per game to get on the board. So if you're looking for a depth line in this game, I think it's Carolina 4 I would look to. Carolina 1 is the line that interests me the most. On the Islanders side, I'm out on Islanders too. Like, I'm not a Hudson Fasching fan. I think one-off Kyle Palmieri or whatever is fine. For me, it'd be between Islanders 1 and Islanders 3 if I'm stacking anything. Now, the point about Jordan Stahl, you're right. Like, this is a brutal matchup against Jordan Stahl. Like we just talked about, that third line, 1.4 expected goals against per 60 with Svechnikov next to Jordan Stahl. Like, they just didn't allow 33 shot attempts against. Like, that's preposterous in any sort of sample. Like, anything larger than a 1-game sample, that is absolutely absurd. Here's the thing is, like, that Islanders top line actually generated a lot with Cizikas there, which feels really weird to say. But 95 minutes together for Cizikas, Barzal, and Horvat. 87 shot attempts, 3.6 expected goals, 3.8 actual goals per 60 minutes. Here's the problem, is that Islanders' top line is 14,400. And you look at other lines in like that 13K-ish range. You have Toronto 2, you have Boston 2, you have even – I probably wouldn't go to Toronto 3, but I think they're in play. So it's like I just think there are other spots that I'd rather go to. I agree with you. If I was 20 maxing, I would have a couple of the Islanders top line. In a single entry, I think I agree with you. I think Islanders 3 is a little bit more interesting because if there's anywhere that Carolina is relatively weak, those second and fourth lines that go out against the opposing bottom sixes are their worst defensive lines. Lee and Engvall actually have good numbers together this season because I wrote up Kyle McLean in the picks article. He's going to be in for Pajot. If Pajot doesn't play, we'll know at warmups. 67.1 shot attempts and 3.7 expected goals per 60 with Engvall and Lee on the ice. Like, that's just a lot of offense. And with guys that cheap, you really only need like a goal and an assist with a handful of shots between them and you're fine. So if you're stacking like Toronto power play or something like that, I think Islanders 3 are in play. But for me, it's Carolina 1, then Carolina 4, then Islanders 1, and then it's probably just picking one-offs elsewhere.
Yeah, I am on board with that. Let's talk about a game that's a little bit more wide open. The Toronto Maple Leafs with a 2.8 total heading into Boston. The Bruins have a 3.1 total. Looks like Willie Nylander is a game-time decision. He wasn't on the ice for optional this morning. I'm going to read into that. What you will, we don't know. They asked the Boston coach who's going to be in net tonight. They said one of the guys wearing pads. Welcome to the playoffs. You're not going to get any information until warm-ups. Now, this game is a lot more wide open, and I think line matching is fairly important in this game. Boston doesn't really hard match at home, though. You're going to see, the top six mix up their matchups against the top six. Now, Boston 1 has the highest top 2 stack on the slate at 38.5%, but 37.3% projected ownership, the highest ownership on the slate. They're home. I get it. Toronto 1 is $200 cheaper with a 30.6% top 2 stack and 26.6% projected ownership. Now, I'm completely fine with Boston 1 because Toronto's PK has suffered all season basically, so they're not fully correlated, are they? I don't know.
Toronto 1?
No, Boston 1. Yeah, they are.
Yeah, they are. Boston 1's on the top power play with Shattenkirk. Boston 2's on the second power play with McAvoy.
Right. So, like, I like Boston 1 from that perspective, that they're on the power play together. Honestly, I think I prefer the Matthews, Bertuzzi, Domi line, just from the standpoint that they've been better. And, they're like, yeah, Boston's still a pretty good defensive team, but this isn't like them going into Bergeron. They're going into Zaka or they're going into Charlie Coyle. Like, sweet. It's fucking Matthews had 69 goals on the season.
Man, I could just feel the Charlie Coyle respect coming out of your mouth as you said that.
I like Charlie Coyle. He shouldn't be a top 6 center on a Stanley Cup contending team.
That's right.
Matthews, Bertuzzi, Domi have been excellent this season offensively. They're a little bit cheaper than Boston 1. They're coming with a little bit of positive leverage. I like them. Toronto 2, like, I get it at 14.5, 20.6% top 2 stack, 20% projected ownership, but like Tavares and Marner just don't play well together. Nyes was really good in the playoffs last year. I don't think I'd full stack that line. Maybe I'd one off a Nyes or one off Marner, or if he, I feel like he's going to shoot the puck. I don't know. I much prefer Toronto 1. I think Toronto 3 is interesting if Nylander plays, just from the standpoint that it's the later game and you probably don't have salary allocated for Nylander. If he does play, he could be a sneaky one-off, but that's really about it for Toronto 3 for me. Boston, I like Boston 1. Don't get me wrong. They're fully correlated. They're just the highest projected own on the slate. Again, I don't give a crap about ownership here tonight, but like for $200 cheaper and, 25, 30% less ownership, I'd rather get the better line in Toronto 1. I think a Pastrnak one-off is an elite play. You can pair him with Zaka, you can pair him with Heinen, you can full stack. You do whatever you want. I just prefer, on the top lines, I prefer Toronto 1 more. Boston 2 is a bit interesting because Marner, Tavares, Nyes have been pretty bad defensively. They're pretty high event. And they're fully correlated on the quote-unquote second unit, right? I don't particularly love that line, but they're 13,200. You know what I mean? It's a price thing. And it's the playoffs. So, and it's the Leafs, and they suck. They don't really suck, but they suck. I prefer, Coyle, Marchand, DeBrusque in the matchup against Tavares, Marner, Nyes. I know they're going to see some of the Matthews line and yay, cool. But if they see their lion's share of the stuff against Tavares, Marner, I like Boston 2. I think, honestly, Boston 3 is where it gets pretty spicy. Trent Frederick has had a really good season. Him and Geeky going up against the bottom 6 of Toronto. I like Frederick as a one-off. I don't think you need a stack. You can one-off Geeky, you can one-off Frederick. You can even one-off Lauko. You can two-man them if you're trying to power play stack Carolina or something like that. You know what I mean? So I do, of the bottom 6, I think Trent Frederick and Morgan Geeky are my favorite.
Yeah, this is an interesting series because it depends where you look, but just about everywhere has this, not quite a coin flip, maybe a little bit in Boston's favor, but 53% for Boston, at the most 56% Boston. This is one of the closer series of the first round. Obviously, these two teams have played each other a lot, but this is, like you mentioned with Bergeron, this is a different iteration of this Boston team without him in the lineup. I think their goals against went up 0.6 compared to last year, which is 27, 28%. It's a lot. It makes sense when you lose one of the best two-way centers of the last quarter century. Nylander, my guess is that he plays.
Same.
But that's just a guess, and we won't know. And like you said, if he's out, if you put Nylander in your lineup and he's out, there's really no swap in that game, right? Because Pastrnak is a lot more expensive. You can go down to Marner, then you're leaving 1,500 on the table. You can do it. It's not ideal, but you can do it. It's also one of those things if I was playing 20 lineups, I might have one or two with Nylander in there and maybe a cheap Toronto defenseman. So put in Nylander and Lyubushkin or something like that. And then, if Nylander's out, you can go to Marner and Liljegren, and then you're not leaving as much salary on the table. That would be that would be the approach that I would take. But as far as the lines go, I did write up David Pastrnak in the article. I was tweeting about him earlier today. I know this isn't the way that it's talked about, but if you want to talk about the most valuable player to a team, this team sucks offensively without David Pastrnak. He was he created 57% more points per minute than the next closest teammate and 58% more goals per minute. It was obscene, the gap between him and everybody else on the roster. It's just they had really good goaltending, so he's not going to get any hard consideration because of that. But he had just a tremendous season. And what I noted in the picks article, now, ice time for top players almost always goes up in the postseason regardless. One of the reasons is because of overtime, right? It's not 5 minutes of overtime. It's continuous. So if you go deep into the first overtime period, there's a lot more ice time available. But his ice time goes up over a minute per game in the playoffs compared to the regular season. He's not going to, unless they're up 5 or 6-1, he's not going to skate 17 minutes. He's going to skate 20 plus. So I'm not that worried about ice time. This whole line, the whole top Boston line is on the top power play unit. And at 5-on-5, they're really good. 3.2 expected goals, 5.6 actual goals per 60 minutes. Now, obviously the shooting percentage is high. But what I noted in that picks article is over the prior 2 seasons, Boston outscored their expected goals rates with Pastrnak on the ice by 28%. So, like, if you just do like 28% or even 25% of 3.2 expected goals, you're looking at 4 goals per 60 minutes, which is elite. So even if there's some pullback, this is still an elite scoring line. I do worry about going into that Matthews line because that Matthews line was not as bad defensively as like we might think that they would be. But I'm not overly concerned about the matchup. And the big reason is the penalty kill, right? I noted in the article, Toronto's penalty kill was 16th by shots against and 26th by goals against per minute over their final in the second half of the season. And it got worse after the All-Star break, and it got worse after the trade deadline. So, like, this was a team really struggling on the penalty kill. Boston's power play was really struggling. That's why they moved Kevin Shattenkirk to the top unit. And what I mentioned with Kevin Shattenkirk is Boston's power play generates over 25% more shots with Shattenkirk than with McAvoy. So if this Boston power play all of a sudden is now, dare I say, even above average or even good against this Leafs penalty kill, I think that's where Boston can really do some offensive damage. And that's why I really do like Boston 1 here tonight. I would probably just full stack them. I was looking at playmaking data for the season from a website called All Three Zones. And Dan Heinen had like his assists on teammate scoring chances were in the first standard deviation above the league average, which is like 85th percentile of all forwards in the league. He had a really good playmaking season. We know Zacha is a good playmaker. Zacha can even chip in some goals. And obviously David Pastrnak is David Pastrnak. I really do like Boston 1 here. I also like Toronto 1. And I take all your points as well with Toronto's top line. Like I did write up Austin Matthews in the picks article today. 42.9 shots, 4.6 expected goals for that Toronto top line. They were just absolutely nuclear. And if Nylander's out, one of Domir Bertuzzi is going to the top power play, right? So then you get 2 out of 3 guys on the top power play unit as well. So I think there is merit to both top lines here, where the top stack is saying 38.5% compared to 30.6% top 2 stack for Boston. That's basically my tiebreaker, right? Is going to the top stacks tool. So I'll say Boston 1, but yes, Toronto 1 certainly in play. I don't have a lot of interest in Boston 2. They just at no point this season have they shown any real ability to score, right? There's never been like a huge sustained hot streak with these 3 guys together. Whenever that they were scoring, it's when they had David Pastrnak on the line. So I'm not too high on Boston 2. Boston 3 is where things get interesting. I did write up, I'm telling you, man, 2-game slates. I wrote up Trent Frederick.
That line's been nasty good.
And yeah, he had 18 goals this year, 40 points. Like, you know, considering he had almost no power play time, like that's really, really good.
Your shooting percentage sucks, but like they'd create a bunch.
Right. And, you know, Frederick and Geeky's on the second power play unit, I believe, with that Boston second line. So he's getting power play time as well. I'm not sure Jacob Lauko honestly finishes the game on that line. So I'd be fine with a 2-man of like just Geeky and Frederick. If you're paying up for like super expensive Carolina, just Geeky and Frederick, if you're stacking like Toronto power play or something like that, I think it's just fine. So like a game stack in this game, I think makes sense more than the other one. I don't really see Carolina and New York going like 6-4 or something. I could see Boston and Toronto doing that though. So I do like Boston 1, then Boston 3, Boston 4. I like this is they don't have a 4th line I have interest in. Same thing on the Toronto side. I don't have interest in their 4th line. It'd be the Carolina 4th line, or dare I even say the Islanders 4th line. I'd have more interest in. Carolina 4 above the rest. Toronto 1, yes, obviously, really good offense. We talked about their numbers. Toronto 2, honestly, man, I'm still on the bandwagon that Marner's not healthy.
Yeah.
That Toronto second line just was not good this season. Marner and Tavares, 225 minutes together, 5-on-5. 2.8 expected goals, 2.9 actual goals. Like a Mitch Marner line under 3.0 goals per 60 minutes. That's just not good enough. I think a one-off Tavares makes sense because he does shoot a fair bit usually. If you need a cheap winger, I guess Nyes is fine as a one-off, but I'd be more interested in Toronto 3 with Nylander. But honestly, if I'm playing Toronto tonight, it's the top line for me. Like there are other teams where I'm interested in second, third, even fourth lines. For me, it's about Toronto 1. So it goes Boston 1, Toronto 1, Boston 3, and then just some one-offs.
Yeah, there's a good chance Marner's been hurt all season. Did you see the end of the season presser for Minnesota? They're like, oh yeah, by the way, Brock Faber's been playing with 2 fractured ribs for 2 months.
Yeah.
Like, okay.
And the funny thing is like once they were eliminated from playoffs, they kept playing. It's like, listen, man, you don't really need to do this. I even wrote like a month into the season at a different website that using that NHL Edge or whatever, looking at, the speed burst and top speed for Marner, it was way down from earlier in the season. A couple months later, he goes on the IR, comes back. He's still been productive, which is the thing. Just hasn't been productive next to Tavares, and that's a big concern for me.
Yeah. Let's talk about these defensemen because they are all cheap. The most expensive defenseman on the board is Noah Dobson at $5,600. Then you have Morgan Riley, $5,400. The one that really sticks out in the quote-unquote top end is Brent Burns at $4,800. Like, that's the lowest price he's been since the beginning of the season. He runs the top power play unit for Carolina. I think he is a fairly obvious choice. Like, going down the list, like Shattenkirk at $3,400 also sticks out a little bit just because their power, like the Leafs penalty kill. Mike Riley. Like, I think from it, I'll go a little bit team by team. Like, if I'm going to do something from the Islanders, it'll probably be a shot blocking defenseman. And that's something like Romanoff, a Pulak, something like that. Carolina, obviously Burns. Toronto, I just don't really like Toronto defensemen, so I think it would be Morgan Riley. But like Boston, there's a couple different angles you can do because I think McAvoy is a good peripherals guy. I think, Shattenkirk runs the top power play unit. And then you have, Hampus Lindholm. You have these cheaper guys. Like, I don't know if Grizzlick's going to be in, but Peak is min-priced. There's a couple min-priced guys you're looking to jam. So, like, I think there's different things for different teams you can do depending on what your build is.
Yeah, this isn't a good defense slate. At least Toronto-Boston's not a good game for defensemen because this is something we talked about at different times during the season, but Toronto is a team that involves their defensemen pretty much the least or amongst the least in the league in their offense. They don't shoot. They don't rack up a ton of points. Like, yes, Morgan Riley does because he's on a great top power play unit, but nobody else really does that much. Like, I think Timothy Liljegren would be the guy that I would go to from Toronto other than Riley if I want to play a Toronto defenseman, just because I think not only does he block a lot of shots, which is one thing I think is kind of underrated about his game. I mean, especially from a DFS perspective, is like Liljegren was over 2 block shots per game this season.
He has more than double the block shots of Quinn Hughes in 25 less games.
Yeah, so there you go. And he does jump into the offense a little bit. So I think Liljegren would be the guy other than Riley. But other than him, like, unless I'm 150 maxing, playing a bunch of lineups and just trying, like, there's no one defenseman from Toronto I'm like, yes, I'd want to play him. It's kind of the same thing on Boston. Like, I agree with you on Shattenkirk. I like Shattenkirk because he's on that power play with Pasternak, and it is a good power play matchup. McAvoy, I think, is fine because he does try to, he's kind of like Liljegren in a sense where he does try to get involved offensively. Now, he's a much better defensive defenseman, but we don't care about that for DFS. But he does try to get involved, and he'll lead their blue line in ice time. But honestly, other than Shattenkirk, there's not a Boston defenseman where I'm like, oh, I really want to play this guy in this matchup. I have a lot more interest in the defenseman from the Islanders-Carolina game. I wrote up Ryan Pulak in the picks article. Even when Noah Dobson was healthy, Dobson missed like a few games there towards the end of the season. even when Noah Dobson was healthy, Pulock was leading the blue line in ice time. And this was when they were chasing down a playoff spot. He was leading the blue line in ice time by like a couple minutes. So I really like Pulock, 3,700 on DK. Really good chance for him to rack up the block shots. Alex Romanoff is going to be paired with Dobson. The stochastic projections have Romanoff slightly ahead of Pulock at a cheaper price. So I guess if you want the guy that's higher projected, you could go with Romanoff. I still think Pulock is the guy just because of ice time, potential ice time differences. On the Carolina side, it's Brent Burns running the top power play unit. Brady Shea, I think, perfectly fine in the top power play unit. Honestly, this is also a slate where I like double defenseman. Like double defenseman is fine on most slates anyway, but Burns and Shea, or Shea and Slavin, or just if you need a cheap defenseman, put in like Orlov with Burns or something like that. I think that's perfectly fine because quite opposite to Toronto, Carolina is a team that involves their defensemen amongst the most in the league, and so do the Islanders. That's something that you and I talked about a lot, especially under Lane Lambert. The Islanders defensemen get involved in a lot of the shooting. It hasn't been as bad under Patrick Waugh, but they still are very involved in the offense. So just in general, I'm more interested in the defensemen from the Islanders Carolina game than Toronto and Boston. Specifically, Burns, Shea, Pulock, Romanoff. Not as much interest in Dobson, especially where he's on the second power play unit now. So yeah. Riley, obviously because he's on the top power play unit, but it's a brutal power play matchup. I think I'd be more interested in the shot blocking guys like Romanoff and Pulock.
Yeah, I'd much prefer to play Shattenkirk to Riley from power play quarterbacks. It's probably similar.
Yeah.
Let's talk about goalies. And I think all four of them are in play. I don't think you should cancel any goalie out unless you're Frostback on a 2-game slate.
And we should say the only officially confirmed goalie is Varlamov.
Varlamov, yeah.
It's likely that Samsonov starts. It's likely that Anderson starts. I don't know who Boston's going to go with. I'm guessing Allmark, but we don't know. So 3 out of the 4 goalies we're not 100% on.
You log into DraftKings, you look at the Boston goalies. They're both 7,900. They both average 14.7 fantasy points per game. So
yeah,
there you go. If you're looking for shot volume, Semyon Varlamov is your guy. If you're looking for a win, Freddie Anderson is probably your guy. I think I prefer the Boston goalie to the Toronto goalie just because they're home. They have a higher total. But again, like if you have a lean on this slate, you play your guy because if you play a goalie that goes to overtime, forget about it. Who was it a couple of years ago? That Columbus game, the Columbus Lightning series, went to like 47 overtime.
It was Korpisalo, wasn't it, when he was still there?
Yeah, he had like 71 saves or something ridiculous like that. They lost, but who cares? If it gets to double overtime, it doesn't matter if you win or lose. The goalie's going to put up like 40 points.
Yeah. Yeah, that's like the upside and downside of DFS playoffs is like, you could like stack Carolina 1 here tonight, and they could, Jake Gensel gets 2 goals, and Aho has a goal and 6 shots, and Jarvis has 2 assists and 3 shots. Like they have a great game, and then Boston goes to triple overtime, and like David Pastrnak has like 14 shots. Pavel Zacha has a shot bonus. Like Dan Heinen has 2 assists and a shot bonus just because they're on the ice so much in the overtime that they end up becoming the ultimate line. Like it's the up and down of NHL DFS playoffs. It does make it fairly exciting. It also makes defense scores pretty funny. Like if Islanders Carolina goes to like triple overtime, there could be like multiple Islanders defenders with like 15 plus DK points through block shots alone. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So that's what kind of makes it weird. I have Varlamov in the picks article just from a shot volume perspective, right? Carolina, heavy shot volume pretty much all season. It is a bit worrisome that the Islanders have been that much better defensively, and that the one weakness is the penalty kill, right? Because that's where all the high percentage shots come from is when they're on the penalty kill. But Varlamov, I think, makes a lot of sense. But I did have Varlamov and then whoever starts for Boston. I worry about Boston's shot volume a little bit. This isn't a team that, pumps the shots on net. In fact, I was looking since the All-Star break, or not the All-Star break, the trade deadline, Boston had the fourth lowest shot rate in the league. Only Anaheim, Washington, and Chicago were lower. Now, Boston's definitely a team that had it on cruise control over the final month of the season, along with Carolina. But I feel way more comfortable saying that, Toronto's way more likely to put up 30-plus shots here tonight than Boston is. So I would prefer the Boston goalies or Varlamov. And I mean, let's face it, Freddie Anderson's in play because there is a lot of shutout equity on his side, right? The goalie stats at Stochastic have Freddie Anderson with a 10% chance of a shutout here tonight. So, there is shutout equity with the Carolina goalies, even if they only face 20 shots.
Yeah. Just gotta hope there isn't a triple overtime game for the goalies you don't have, you know what I mean? So you don't even just pounding sand, shaking your fist in the air. Who are you liking for your hat trick pick?
I'm going to go with one of my favorite guys from, it was the 2021 draft. Really high on him. He's really turned it. He's really had a great season. Had him in the picks article today. I'm going with Seth Jarvis.
I got to remain spicy. You know what I mean? I am who I am. Trent Frederick.
I want that just because I want to see Leafs Twitter at midnight with everybody drunk on a Saturday after they get beat by a Trent Frederick hat trick.
Oh, there is. If you're anyone who's played DFS or loves hockey or anything, Leafs Twitter after they lose in a playoff game is peak comedy.
Yeah,
love it.
Best thing in the world.
Yeah. We will be back on Monday because they're doing that big puck drop. It's a 4-game slate, so we'll actually have a little bit more to talk about, a little bit more strategy than a 2-game slate. After that, we're going to play it by ear, see what the contests look like, et cetera, et cetera. But excited for playoff hockey. Glad we can do a couple shows in playoffs. Good luck, everybody, tonight, and go Rangers.
Whatever.